everyone. Welcome. I'm Jo, and you're in Cultivating Belonging Exploring Diasporic Relationships to Land. So if you're in the wrong room, you have time to leave now. I'm really excited to introduce this discussion between Rachel and Claire, exploring the intersection of Claire and Rachel's heritages and identities to understand how diasporic people might find belonging wherever they are. Claire and Rachel are amazing human beings with a lot to share today. So I'm so excited for you guys to listen to this. I just want to start with a little bit of a welcoming. So I'm just welcoming everybody into the space, all of our different identities, experiences, and relationships to land. Whether we are, we have a regular relationship to land, whether we don't, whatever we're coming with today, just welcoming all of that into this space. Within that, I want to welcome any emotions that come up during this talk. There might be some, intense things that arise, so just welcoming whatever comes up in your bodies. Encouraging you to be rooted in your body and accepting whatever comes up. Before we start, I also want to note how important it is that we are talking about these issues at ORFC. Food growing is a deeply political act, and to be discussing the political and the personal, to be discussing rootedness and belonging, is to embed deeper stories and histories into our land work. A few little logistical things. This room is quite big, and we're going to be talking about quite intimate things. So I just want to name that, this is an intimate discussion. And maybe, the room's pretty big. In kind of linking to this, during our Q&A section, there might be some questions that Rachel and Claire don't want to answer. And we ask you to be aware of this and to accept this. That's just, going to be how it's going to be. Claire and Rachel are also not speaking for their whole communities, despite having a wealth of knowledge and experience to share. So please bear that in mind as you listen and process this talk as you go about your day. The structure of the talk is we will be speaking for about half an hour to 45 minutes, and then we'll have about 15 minutes or so for questions. We will not be going for an hour and a half. We'll be aiming for around an hour mark, so you'll be able to leave a little bit early. I think that's all from me for now, so without further ado, I'll let Claire and Rachel introduce themselves through asking the question, what made you start thinking about land work through the context and lens of your identity? And feel free to share the journey that brought you to where you are now.
So amazing when you get asked this question, because you feel like there's so many different, I feel like there's so many different routes that brought me to where I am now. And my journey to land work started a long time before my kind of bringing my own racialist identity into that picture. They're separate by about 10 years, which is kind of interesting. And I grew up in a really urban context, and then in my early 20s, moved into the rural and started growing and cultivating and really just finding beautiful connection to land in a way that I hadn't ever really experienced before, or maybe kind of like disparate moments when I was a child. And just loving, plunging myself into water and walking through woodlands and caring for soil and feeling a kind of deep sense of relief and connection to land in that way. And I also was doing research work along that journey, and I did a master's in kind of sustainable horticulture, and then I did a second master's where I was working with black radical farmers in the States. And that was like my first real dive into justice work, and I was kind of like 8 years into my growing journey by that point. But I still was only thinking of myself as a white person at that point. I wasn't thinking about my own Jewish heritage at all in terms of relation to land. And it was through reading reading Black radical scholarship, and particularly work that considered the Jewish physician, that I suddenly began to connect to my own cultural heritage and how that was actually relevant to me. And it was kind of remarkable that I disassociated so much from, to some extent, by leaving behind my Jewishness when I left the city, because in the rural there was no place to cultivate that cultural heritage. There was no other community to help me in that journey to bring my Jewishness into those spaces, and so I left them behind. And it was kind of like I was suddenly reading all of this beautiful writing that connected heritage to land, that thought about how important it was to understand the context of like resistance and struggle, and in the work and how it's embodied in land work. And I guess those were the kind of like tentative moments of like going, okay, my Jewishness is both incredibly important to me, and I need to find a way to integrate it, otherwise I've ignored part of myself. And also that discussion is important to bring into spaces like these.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Yeah, I mean, there's so much resonance in my journey, albeit incredibly a different one in many ways. First of all, I haven't been doing land work and growing for as long as you, but I would say that I came round to a kind of sense of that my identity had something to say about the work that I'd found myself called to fairly quickly, and because I started growing when I was in a totally different career and I was completely disconnected from the natural world. It was something I grew up in a suburban context with a very particular kind of immigrant holding of my childhood, which was very much not facing the natural world, or they didn't perceive the natural world as somewhere that I should be spending my time or pointing my life towards. And so when I came to growing, it was completely by chance when I was living in New York, and it was actually when I came back to London and started actually genuinely retraining in horticulture while working in market gardens, that under the kind of umbrella of the Brexit conversation, that I was simultaneously developing this practice that I felt so like my entire body felt like I was doing the exact thing I was put in this place to do. I was designed to do land work. At the same time having to dance with this lifelong unbelonging, this lifelong grief that I have carried with me, living in this country and being somebody who has been told in many different ways that I don't belong here, that I'm not truly of this land, and to cultivate the soil of a land that represented that became a real it was a conflict. It was so painful, and I didn't know necessarily how to articulate that at the time or even process that. And so all I would see is just these kind of unfolding conversations in the news and the newspapers of like all the same old conversations, all the same old tropes of of who's supposed to be here and who isn't, and what people wanted to do about that. And so I think I sort of found myself both explicitly and implicitly, internally and externally, starting having conversations around what it means to grow and work with plants as somebody with a racialized identity, somebody with a diasporic identity, and with a colonized identity. And because my family is from Mauritius, and it has a very particular colonial story in that it is an island that was unpopulated, and so it was various empires that populated that small island with people, and so my heritage, albeit that I didn't really truly understand it at the time because it's something I'd shut myself off from for a really long time, is one of lineage of enslavement and of indentureship, and a sense that both land work is a site of oppression and of suffering, and something to move away from, and that our homeland is actually this place that was magicked up in the eyes of oppression and oppressors and colonialism, and so there's so many kind of troubling concepts started to sort of coalesce at the same time that I was doing this very heartfelt and embodied practice that felt so much like a calling and still does, and so over the years I sort of very much on a kind of personal, but in my very own particular personal context, wanted to come to understand why I didn't know so much about my own history, and in uncovering what I could find of that story, try and come to reclaim land work as something that is an empowered and is a beautiful, is a birthright, is a divine thing outside of that narrative of oppression. And so that's a sort of bumbling, complicated way of saying that's how I kind of came into this conversation, and and why I guess I find myself here today, and it's why I wrote my book, and
I find it really interesting that some of us who haven't come from farming backgrounds can come to land work as a site of healing, but the healing can't take place until we bring in our identities and our experiences, and we really start to delve into what that means in the context of land work. And I feel like that's a good little segue into. You say in your book, Unearthed, Claire, that sometimes there's difficulty with not knowing which mother country to call our own when we're connecting with land. So I want to ask you both, what is your historical relationship to land, and how does that link to your heritage, your culture, your ancestry, and your current relationship with it?
I mean, that's a complicated question. It's a big question. I suppose, sort of as I was alluding to before, I felt the urge, because the history of Mauritius was one that my parents weren't taught. They were brought into the world and educated as subjects of the British Empire. They were never taught the history of their island, and so it was never something that was ever communicated to me, and it does seem like it is a uniquely poorly documented history, and so I felt that I needed to come to understand, I needed to come to know that story in order to locate myself within it, and it was in that process that I because of that particular context of when I was doing my research, realizing that the enslaved people who were brought to Mauritius came from so many different places, so much of East Africa, but as far as West Africa also, and other places across the Indian Ocean, that a sense of like coherent identity or lineage or ancestry was always going to evade me, and so there's a passage in my book, I always reference it as like the bit is a bit of a departure from the rest of the book, which is very much sort of in the non-fiction, like it fits within the kind of non-fiction context. It's a section about the Maroons in Mauritius, the enslaved who left the plantations and they ran into the mountains. It's the only story I was ever told as a child, and about the enslaved people there. And it tells this story of how they left the plantations, and they went into the forest, they went into the mountains, and they planted gardens of of defiance, and they foraged, and they took care of each other, and they built community as resistance against their enslavement, and it has an incredibly sad ending, that particular story, but there was something about this idea that what was being imposed upon them was something that they could resist. They called each other by the names that they carried, even though those names were being erased, and they created new identities and new ways of being. And I just found that idea so that truth, that reality, that narrative so powerful, to see that it's possible to create we were talking yesterday about creating rituals, traditions of our own, and what it means to give ourselves permissions for that. And actually, like, we all carry those lineages of resistance, of creating, stories, traditions, rituals, practices on our own terms. And so, yeah, I think it's only through kind of trying to find coherence that I found that incoherence was the answer, and that, like, belonging to land must transcend nationhood. And whilst, obviously there's inherent contradiction in there, isn't there? Because I'm so hungry for what was lost. There's so much in there that I still carry. That grief will never really go away. And I think that's why the practice of land work is something that I do in order to grow plants into that broken place. There is an element of, like, divinity to recognizing that there's, like, the beauty in being able to just be always in that becoming, and always in that there is belonging in that, and it is a practice. It's a cycle, like growing plants is.
Thank you. It's a really brilliant question, and actually I feel lucky I can draw on this practice that I've learned about telling land stories from this amazing organisation called Linkerfliegel in the States, who are kind of queer Jewish farm in the States, and they do this kind of brilliant, amazing cultural theory. And one of their practices for telling land stories is to think about these kind of, like, intersecting circles that we all kind of sit within when we think about ourselves in relation to land. And the kind of three circles are, where we are now, how we got there, our relationship to that land, our relationship to the peoples of that land. And then a second circle being our cultural heritage, the stories of migration, displacement, multiple migrations, whether they were forced migrations or not forced migrations. Was there enslavement? Was there genocide? And the third being the kind of relationship to homeland, motherland, whatever that might be. And so, speaking to those different aspects, mainly the kind of, like, latter two that I just mentioned there, one of the things I can be grateful for, I suppose, is that I do have knowledge of the history of my family, particularly from one side, that I can trace actually hundreds of years, which is quite remarkable, and I know that it's not something that everybody has access to, especially with histories of multiple displacement. I'm descended from Jewish communities that would have, like, lived in kind of Moorish Iberian Peninsula in Spain and Portugal, and then Muslims and Jews were expelled from that land in 1492, a date that might be familiar for other reasons. And my family then lived in Salonika, now Thessaloniki, in Spain. For 400 years they lived there, and their language is still Ladino, which is a mixture of Spanish and Arabic and Hebrew. And that language still remained in Salonika until the early 20th century, when, with the rise of fascism, my family fled that land, and there was generations of movement every generation across Europe, until finally ending up in the UK in actually 1939 that my family managed to make it to the UK. And I feel like for 5 generations prior to me, there had been a forced migration in every generation, but there had been relative stability before that in Thessaloniki. And there's this kind of absolute grief that, particularly around the language of Ladino, because I was born, my great-great-grandmother was still alive when I was born. She spoke Ladino. Ladino was her first language, and I don't speak it, and there was a lineage there. And the erasure is so tangible, it's so recent. And I've got recordings of her and her singing all these songs. And there's this kind of, like, amazement that I am of the first generation then that got to choose to move out of choice again, after to choose to move to the rural, that was something that I could have the freedom to do, is kind of amazing and tragic. So I have this, I think I hold in that, when I kind of draw on that narrative and I think about like Homeland, and I think about like the Jewish diaspora, which is obviously thousands of years old, and I'm like, which is what motherland are we talking about here? Is it Spain and Portugal? Is it Greece? You know, is it like Eretz Israel, which is what I think I grow up, you know, when you kind of grow up in kind of mainstream Jewry in this country, there's this, you know, our liturgy is filled with like a yearning for the homeland of Eretz Israel, and I use that term because I want to really distinguish Eretz Israel, which I kind of feel as a kind of mythical homeland that we carry with us. Really distinctly want to like name that as something different from what has been created in the name of homeland for Jewish people, which is a kind of really misguided idea that belonging to land means ownership or sovereignty of nation state, and that is a really, yeah, they're so distinct for me. The idea that in order to be safe we have to have nation statehood, and that includes sovereignty and hierarchy is a truly misguided interpretation of, in my opinion, of what it means to carry homeland and need belonging. And for me, Eretz Israel could be found here. Belonging can be found here, and it takes time to feel empowered in that kind of feeling that you can bring homeland to a place, and it becomes a very political thing. Like, you know, I distinguish diaspora from diasporism. Like for me, diasporism is like this is like really relating to what you've just been saying. You know, like it's a practice. It's a political choice to be like I'm diasporic, which means how am I going to phrase this properly? Yeah, it's a political choice to believe that people belong on land, and that we all have the right to be on land, and that diasporism kind of contains within it all of the kind of like multiplicities of what it means to be people that have moved again and again and again, and that in any one place your cultural heritage both can be renewed and draw on the kind of like fight and resistance and belonging from the past, and also hybridize with where you are in the present. In fact, it has to do that in order to survive. And that's why Ladino is a mixture of Hebrew and Spanish and Arabic, and it is a beautiful language and a powerful language. It's not just Hebrew, it's an amalgamation of all of the things that is contained within it. And that any practice must be a practice. It must like live in the now in order to be relevant, and not kind of get stuck and kind of you know, I think there's this, sometimes we get this idea that in order to like be true to a cultural heritage, we have to like hark back to this like previous time where it was like, this is how we are, this is how we'll be, and this is what we do. And it's like those there's something really misguided about thinking about this kind of like essentializing version of self that is stuck. We are always changing and mixing and hybridizing and creolizing and in the present, and yeah.
And I just feel like the possibility in that is so. It's so enlivening, and it's so beautiful, and it's the first time that it has felt like a belonging can be cultivated on my own terms. As someone who's, I mean, we've talked a lot about kind of what assimilation has done to us, and or what we have done in the name of assimilation, and what we have lost, we talked a bit about, we've been talking a bit about rituals and traditions and how our different experiences of that, because for me, I was brought up Catholic, you know, like truly like a colonial force that particularly was used to erase all that came before it in the enslaved populations, because it's principally, I mean, actually there's lots of different Catholics in Mauritius now, but it's principally in the Kreyol community. And so, you know, thinking of my entire childhood in the Catholic Church, and which is very ritualistic and iconographic, and you know, and has all of these things that I don't feel any instinctive blood-bone connection to, and then in England, you know, I often see, you know, we were talking about this yesterday about, you know, the ways in which the growing season is celebrated in solstice rituals and that are grounded in paganism and druidism, and for me, that, you know, it isn't something that I feel instinctively connected to, but I ache for, I yearn for. And so, you know, when I see other people feeling these deep connections to those practices and those you know, markers in the year and traditions, those deeply held traditions, I feel so much aching. And yet, when we talked about the possibility of allowing ourselves permission to create the traditions that arise for us, and that those don't have to, they can echo and they can honour our ancestries and the lineages that we carry, and those of other people and those that we are in relationship to. But they can be new, and they can be, and still have the same, you know, resonance. It doesn't have to be found in a dusty tome. It can be the practice that we do with one another when we are, you know, we are connecting through relationship to land. And I just, yeah, that just feels like an incredible possibility.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because I live in Wales now, and I think that the kind of the Celtic and the pagan rituals that come through are quite prevalent, and it's kind of brilliant. And I love to join the wassail, and you know, solstice is a big deal. And I have, you know, I lived there for 13 years now, and for a really long time that was the kind of like demarcation of the year was like done through those traditions, and kind of in a weirdly secular way, but drawing on those, and then. You know, it was through work with Sarah and Samson there, sitting in the front row, that I was kind of like reintroduced to Jewish rituals that follow a really similar calendar. You know, like I'm kind of, you know, the Imbolc might also be at the same time as Tu B'Shvat, and we get to go and like honour trees, and that comes from my own tradition, and I've forgotten or never been told, and that I can do that in the rural, and that my ancestors would have done that in the rural, and that it, for many generations that has been contained in a much more urban space because of the histories of migration that have meant that Jewish people have been largely urban for a really long time. But to kind of like take that back and be like, okay, and how am I going to do this ritual in a way that feels authentic to me and like draws on that heritage, but also, you know, like puts it back in this rural place where I now I'm feeling very like I want to be in the rural places, and I get to celebrate these traditions here. It is amazing. Like, and it is. I mean, I definitely feel like I'm in the beginning, very much at the beginning of my journey, or you know, like getting in wild water is a really big deal for me. I love swimming, and I think that there's often a big ritual around kind of plunging your body into cold water and you know, like washing stuff away, and to kind of be, I was again just like gifted this like knowledge that in the Jewish tradition there's this. You can do mikvah. You can go and you can like say a blessing as you like plunge your body into water, and it's you come out renewed. And that I was like, wow, that's mine, and that's amazing. And yeah.
Thank you so much for answering so beautifully. Just hearing you speak, I'm thinking of like this patchwork practice that we bring in from with our ancestry and our heritages, our histories, also our current relationships, and all of this myriad of things that we bring to how we connect to land. Just picturing something complex and beautiful, and it's just gorgeous hearing you speak. And I'm wondering, like we've kind of traversed a little bit of your histories. What is a piece of land that you currently feel really connected to, or the most connected to? And I guess a kind of question linked to that is that the same piece of land that you feel the most belonging to? Is that something different?
That's a good question. I moved out of London into the Sussex countryside about 4 months before the pandemic, and in fact, the kind of backbone of my book is my first year moving to the countryside, and it was a big wrench to like leave what felt like safety and familiarity to dare to go into the rural, which had very much felt for the entirety of my life as a space that I could never be comfortable and safe in. And so to answer that question now, especially somebody, at the moment I'm not doing land work in the way that I have done before. I'm not growing for market or growing to feed people. I'm very much devoted to like the little patch of land right outside of my home. But I think the thing that has felt that has cultivated the most possibility for connection to this very small patch of land and very, very heavy Sussex clay is the practice of growing like Mauritian vegetables into Sussex soil, you know, and so at the moment I really do feel very deeply connected to this very small patch of land that I have kind of devoted my stewardship to. And that's not to say that like just beyond that I live in a very particular place. It's very particular politics, and I am very much surrounded with things that I'm in deep opposition to. I think that for me the practice of growing the food of my family, the food that raised me, the food that raised my parents particularly, because I think it has been an incredible thing to grow certain vegetables and offer them up to my parents who I think even though I've been writing a book about it has made it slightly make more sense to them, but were baffled, still are somewhat baffled by my move away from like a media career into doing something that was, you know, honestly they grew up with the story that was not the place that we go to. That's not the site that we return to. Has enabled me to create a relationship to land that I never really realised was possible. And so yes, the piece of land that I feel most connected to at the moment is that little piece of very loved, nurtured, fertile earth where Mauritian vegetables grow. But I mean, I wonder what it would be like. I haven't been back to Mauritius for a while, and I certainly haven't been since learning so much more about the history and then writing a book about it. So it'd be interesting to see what my relationship feels like when I go back to, and see my family there. So.
I guess, yeah, I feel very connected to the Dobby Valley where I live, and I have got a lovely home and a place to grow veg. When I was working as a market gardener, it was in a different space, but I mean, in a way, it is the valley itself. You know, it's like the holding of this, you know, rugged and tender land, and it's really wet and lush and with beautiful woodlands. And I feel very committed, I would say, to that place in a way that there's a kind of like, does feel like there's a kind of really deep love and longing there. And I remember when I first went there, there's this beautiful estuary, and kind of like walking, the water was out, it's a tidal estuary and the water was out, and like walking in this kind of like big, expansive, sandy space, and it was actually quite windy, and there was kind of like sand trailing around my feet, and you can kind of like see out to the sea, and you've got like Snowdonia to the north of you, and just feeling like this is a magical, like a deeply magical place, and I just want to stay here. So I do feel really connected to that, and then tending soil and watching food grow and watching it nourish people and feeling like you contribute to a kind of like nourishing of the land and the nourishing of the people. And I've only ever worked at kind of like really small scale in terms of market gardening, and kind of really known where everything's going, you know, small veg boxes just like in my little community. And that's always felt like a really powerful thing. And then sometimes I feel like I could move as well, you know. I can't, I don't, it's interesting. I don't feel like I couldn't find that connection in other places. I don't think anymore. Maybe for a long time I felt like I definitely just needed to be there. There is something amazing about the feeling that you can cultivate belonging, that you can literally in giving yourself to land and care and connection and meeting land where it is, feel like you can feel connected to the place and the people of that place, and that being a really important thing. You know, I'm really aware that I'm an English person in Wales as well, and that there's there's a complicated history of culture erasure that exists in that as well, and that I need to be very aware of that. And I think one of the things that is also deeply lacking for me is I still don't have I don't have my Jewish community there. It's not that I don't have any, there is some, but it is something that is increasingly important and missing for me. And I'm not sure how to make... I feel like I'm beginning to find ways to like bring those identities together, but it's missing. It's not quite fixed. It's not quite done yet. And I'm sure there's a way. And I've got kids, and so it becomes important that they have an understanding of that heritage as well. And at the moment, it feels like it's just me, and that's not enough.
I think it's particularly, it's interesting that this conversation's happening in the main hall, which I'm still finding incredibly intense, by the way. But that it's happening at this particular farming conference, I feel makes sense, because I think there's something particular about the ways in which I'm sure everybody in this room either grows themselves or wants to see the world grow more, that is disrupting extractivism and is about building relationship, and is about, even if it's just very practically, if you want your soil to be Soil Association certified, you have to devote yourself to it, you know, and you have to turn up for it and to think about how it operates and how it works, and I think when you are learning in that way, growing in that way, and practicing that every day, that's relationship, isn't it? It's not a simple equation. It's a system of which you are part, and that you participate in, and that you observe, and that you celebrate, and that you cry over, you know, and it's all the kind of complications of building relationship is happening when you are cultivating in the way that we do, and then yes, that beautiful part of the relationship, particularly when it comes to food, where you are harvesting and offering that up for the nourishment and enrichment of other people, is like it's just such a rich and important part of the process, and I think that's why I could be wrong, but I'm guessing that at the farming conference, the other farming conference, they're probably not having conversations that sound like this, because I don't imagine that their sense of the relationship when the only kind of success factor is productivity, then this conversation will probably be incredibly abstract and bizarre, honestly. But I do think there is something particular about us having this conversation here, where whilst obviously production and productivity, sustainability, financially and otherwise, is really obviously key, that I haven't heard anybody here who is speaking about that in isolation of their relationship to the land that they work and the work that they do and how they feel about feeding people.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so important that we're having this discussion now. And yeah, bringing these topics into talking about land work. And I want to bring it back to some of the themes that we've talked about before, about connecting to land beyond nationhood. Claire, you say in your book, you talk about a sense of belonging that cannot be undermined by that which is man-made, which I love. I love that sentence. So I'm curious about, I guess we've touched on this already, but if you could talk about what diasporic connection to land means to you, emotionally, physically, what does it look like? How
does it feel to me? I mean, one of the hardest sections of my book to write was about my relationship to blackness, because, well, for so many reasons, because it is how I'm racialised in this country, but it doesn't capture the complexity of my heritage, my identity, and also when we are essentialist about race, we are effectively upholding a system that is built on lies and designed to divide us up. And so I think when you start kind of shaking the foundations of those understandings of how we compartmentalise ourselves or compartmentalise each other, then it bleeds out into other spaces, right? And obviously we are thankfully disrupting so many binaries. But one of the things that I see is quite hard to disrupt in, obviously, this particular context in England, in Britain, but elsewhere, is that sense of nationhood that it's not that it's unquestionable. What do I mean? It's that it's so hard to pull at the edges of, because people are so attached to a sense of identity that is connected to land. I mean, we call them our roots for a reason, right? And so when people have an identity that is very connected to one particular geographical space or a cultural, a set of cultural kind of practices, traditions, ancestries, whatever, it's hard when people come in and say, let's just get rid of our borders, this is all meaningless, this is all man-made. But I do think that, like, there is a way to dance with those things that make it so that they are not hard lines that keep people in and keep people out, and that is really essential for me, because I'm somebody who if somebody said go back to where you came from, which has been said to me and so many other people in this room, I'm sure, like, where would I go, you know? And so racial essentialism, national essentialism, it doesn't work for me in any way, shape or form. And so that's why diasporic identities make so much sense, because all you'd have to, you know, I think we could all find ways of disrupting our sense of, and if you have a sense of essential identity, there are ways of disrupting that, and there's so much more potential and possibility, and the possibility for connection and genuine belonging that exist outside of those paradigms. It's just, we have been so indoctrinated to believe that we need to find a tribe in which we kind of can close ourselves off and create you know, a holding that then creates a them, and that just doesn't work for me. It never will, because I'll always probably find myself alone if that's something that I believe in as sacrosanct, you know. And so yeah, I think, I don't know if I answered that question. I actually can't remember the question, but I was going somewhere with that. But yes, that which is man-made. Well, yeah, it's you know, there is so many ways in which we've been carved up historically, and most of those who have created those categories, who've created that compartmentalization, did not have our thriving, incredible, intersecting, enlivening beings in mind. They weren't trying to make it possible for us to thrive, right? We were designed to live within those constraints in a beautiful and free, fugitive way, right? So whatever we can do to tear those down, I'm here for it. And I know we live on an island, which makes that particularly hard, but, you know, borders are straight lines because someone did that, you know, and we can tear those up.
Absolutely.
Even if we tear up the borders in our minds, at very least.
There's just so many different things I want to respond to. But I'm going to try and stick to the kind of question about diasporic identity. I guess, you know, there's a kind of like this idea that, like, you know, the reality is I include myself as part of a Jewish diaspora, and that Jewish diaspora is everywhere. It's on every continent. We're not all white. We're like so multiple and multiplicitous, and like there's this kind of ancient word that Jews use for themselves, which is ivri, which means border crosser. We were like people that migrated and moved, and we have been for millennia. And I think that you know, it's so important to remember that, you know, the nation state is a colonial tool. It was created for the categorization and enclosure of people, to create homogenous identities where people were like, you know, to feel British, you're meant to like be a certain thing and act in a certain way. And so many of us, probably most of us, have some kind of aspect of ourselves that doesn't feel like it fits into that category. That's homogenized identity with like one language and one heritage and one thing. and feel excluded from that. And yeah, it's this idea that there's an alternative for me is that, you know, and also how we like access our like human rights is like via the nation state. If you become stateless, then you have no access to like all of kind of like essential human rights. And people become stateless all the time after like, you know, and that, you know, Hannah Arendt, who's like a Jewish philosopher, a Holocaust survivor, wrote directly after the UN Declaration for Human Rights in 1949, she wrote a book, Origins of Totalitarianism, and wrote, you know, that there was a misguided thing in that Declaration for Human Rights because human rights were given to us only via statehood, via access to the nation state. And so if you are displaced because of war, because of enslavement, and you end up in the position where you're stateless, you have no access to human rights, and that is mad. We have the right to rights. We have the rights wherever we are, and that is beyond borders. And so yeah, and I think I said this earlier. For me, a kind of like reclamation of the diasporic identity. It's like, to some extent, it's also an antithesis to kind of the Zionism that I was like brought up with, soft Zionism, that was like, you know, if you have a nation state that is yours, it's this one, and I reject that. And for me, this kind of diasporic identity is the alternative that I feel is available to me. I'm like, I have the right to be Jewish here on this land. That's okay. I can be Jewish here, and I can be Jewish somewhere else, and it doesn't have to be only one place that is mine. And I disagree with the nation-state concept fundamentally, basically.
I love that you both touched on the arbitrary nature of borders in the context of connecting to land. I think, yeah, it's just such an imperative thing to talk about at this juncture when we're talking about what land really means. I'm really aware of the time, and we have a couple of other points. I want to ask a question that is quite a big question, and I feel like, as ever, we're not going to have enough time to delve into it as we might like, but I'm wondering if you could speak to what repair and reparations mean in the context of, yeah, your own experiences.
It's a very big question. I mean, reparations is it's a real thing. It's a thing that needs to happen in a settler colonial state. It's about land back. And when it comes to colonised nations, it's about redistribution of wealth that was ill-gotten. And so often that is tied to land. In this country, it's particularly tied to land, and the number of colonial states that have not only aggrandised themselves off the back of hundreds of years of forced labour, but also continue to close themselves off from the people who live on this land now, who should and ought to have access to it, not just to keep it for themselves, but also for it to be used for the commons, effectively, for people to engage with. And so, yeah, as far as I'm concerned, reparations is like something that needs to have happened 100 years ago. It needs to happen yesterday. It needs to happen forevermore. And I'm really excited to see what some governments are doing in certain, like if we look at Barbados and what they're trying to do, and finally trying to pull up the Drax family. Finally, fingers crossed, everybody. If you don't know what I mean, it's worth looking up. With any luck, they'll actually, start paying back what addressing historical wrongs, and that wealth needs to be pushed back into nations that have been historically pillaged. What does repair look like? I mean, I think repair is, that's reparations is the kind of the global, the political, and then repair, which is not in itself not apolitical, but it is the for me, it's the personal journey of kind of reconciling all of these seemingly contradictory narratives and these truths that feel like they might be in conflict. And it's not necessarily about finding coherence, but it is about finding some healing, some peace around what it means to be someone who lives on this land that has made them feel so at odds with the many identities that exist within this one body. And land work is how I is the practice through which I'm accessing that healing and accessing that repair. And I think that is, inherently it is political, and then you recognise the ways in which it connects us to other justice struggles, other injustices that exist both on this land and elsewhere. And I think it is, once that kind of gateway, that prism is open, then you see the possibility of I could see the possibility of a world that looks more just and that looks more equitable, that looks thriving and abundant and actually exists and isn't just going to collapse into, a kind of climate crisis disaster, And so I think, repair for me is the personal, and reparations is what needs to happen in order for us to all move towards a more just future together.
Thank you. It's really interesting. I just want to briefly say, on the kind of reparations topic, that there has been attempts at reparations for kind of multiple genocides and exclusions for Jewish people in Europe. And one of the things that I have found is that there's 2 countries that I could apply for citizenship to because of historic exclusion. And I think that that's a kind of interesting and slightly bizarre way that reparative justice could be offered to me, is become a combination of another place that is I've never lived in and has never been my home. And it's, there's so many scholars doing brilliant work about reparations, and I'm not a scholar of reparative justice, and I don't know those, but I think that's an interesting thing to look into if you're interested. That is one way that reparative justice has been thought of, and I don't know how well. It doesn't sit that well with me. In terms of repair and reclamation, I think we've touched on it. It's about being able to find a kind of, to some extent, bring an authentic way of honouring cultural heritage in the now and in the practices of the now, and recognising that that there is a legitimate desire to reconnect to, that I have a legitimate desire to reconnect to land that has been, me and generations of my family have been excluded on for hundreds of years, and that it's the desire to be able to tend land and care for land and be on land is so strong, and the idea of Jewish farmers is so incongruous in exactly the same way that you're saying, this idea, Jews. I remember when I first moved into kind of rural spaces having this Jews don't farm narrative, and I was what do you mean we don't farm? We're in this agrarian culture historically, but it's so distant, and it's still something I kind of get from kind of familial from my family, that my kind of expedition into the rural is some kind of phase that I'm going to grow, there's some kind of increase. So there's this absolute legitimate desire to reconnect to land, and that's really important, and that it still sits in tension with all of real participation as a white British person and benefiting from colonial history, and the tension of that. I feel it all of the time, and I think about it a lot of the time, that there's that these conversations are so important to kind of break open. And there's the kind of, in terms of prepare, that's in all of the stuff I've just talked about is in the political, I suppose, and then in the personal, it's just practices and trying to find what my community looks like. They're amazing. I guess there's something kind of incredible about the tools that we have available to us now that I don't feel like my community needs to exist only in the spaces immediately around me, that I can connect to people across distance and find community across distance and actually have real relationships that kind of bring me nourishment and healing that aren't, you know, my neighbours, although it'd be better if they were. And yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, and like reclamation definitely comes into this for me.
Yeah.
Like it's not just, it's a bit of like going, oh, maybe I'm going to go and learn that language that died with my great grandmother, or maybe I'm going to go and, really seek out and investigate the histories, like the kind of amazing histories that have really got me to this place and where they've been erased, and really, I feel so much resonance with you when you speak about that stuff. It's just like, actually, what are those histories? Because why haven't I been taught them? Why do I know so much more about other cultures' histories of radical action on land than my own? And they do exist, and when I find them, it's like, fireworks. So beautiful.
And it's the same for me. This idea of reclamation is I think comes up multiple times in my book. But there is something about understanding that we existed before those migrations, and our lineage was disrupted, and that was a colonial project or a genocidal project, and those things happened, but we existed before that, and we all come from a lineage of land workers, and that the stories that we are offered up don't have to be the stories that we carry. And I think that like reclamation is the word, isn't it? It's that idea that we can perceive of ourselves outside of the like dominant narrative that have told us that there is only one way of understanding our history, and that kind of unearthing of erased histories, I think is like, I think it's just the work of our lifetime, because I think we've been told a really very powerful story, and it has shaped society in so many ways, and sometimes it can feel like we're having to start afresh and imagine anew, and actually we carry the blueprint of resistance and in our blood and bones. There's been resistance throughout time. It just doesn't tend to make it into the dominant narrative, and I think that's what like reclamation can look like. We can all be the fugitives that abscond the plantation, and it's like we have that lineage in us, and so.
Thank you so much for bringing the word story in, because I think about that a lot when I think about reclamation. I think about almost like erasing these stories that I've been taught, that I've internalized as truths, but actually aren't truths at all, and what myths and stories can I put in their place that are real to me. So thank you so much for bringing that, and also just when hearing you talk about repair and reparations, like, it's making me think about the personal and the political, and how these things are one and the same. Like the healing that we do on a personal level has to come alongside political liberation, and there's no way that they can be separated. So thank you so much for those beautiful answers. We have one little point left, but we are at 12 o'clock.
If we'll go to questions.
Do you want to go to the last question, and then we'll go?
Yeah, it's up to you. What do you think?
Yeah.
Or we could go to audience questions. I can't believe it's 12 already.
Yeah, it's gone quite quickly. Okay, so I guess it's linked to what we've been talking about, reclamation. What has helped you on your journey to reclamation?
That's just a really amazing and quite short answer for me, which is just finding other people that are on that journey with me. And just speaking to other people and finding synergies with other people that are also on a kind of bit of a quest to figure all of this stuff out and put all those things together.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I suppose writing my book, honestly, is whilst it was something that I very fortunately was able to do in the kind of formal system of having it published, I think it was a book that I was always going to try and write in some way or another, because I think I was always trying to create a sense of coherence. I wanted to kind of, find these erased histories, have a reason to find the history of Mauritius and a sense of the history of my own people, and then bring that into dialogue with where I found myself and what I found myself called to do. And so it was just, a kind of, it was a deadline, actually. It was just like, you've got 8 months to do your first draft. So I was like, great, I had a reason to just get on with it and figure it out. So, yeah, it really wasn't as easy as getting on with it and figuring it out. But it was, in a strange way, it was, I almost embarked on a constrained project of learning about myself, and actually trying to put words to what I had been carrying and thinking and feeling and reflecting on and conversing about for a number of years. And so there is something really powerful about just the act of writing, whether it ends up as a book or anything else, of feeling that there are so many stories that tell our story for us, and then feeling like you actually have the agency to write a story for yourself. It's been a powerful thing.
Thank you so much. Thank you both for your vulnerability and your beautiful answers. I'll double check that I've not forgotten anything before we move on to questions.
Is there any more water anywhere? Sorry, I've drunk all of mine.
Yes, you can have some of mine.
Thank you so much.
No, we're all good. Okay. I guess we'll move on to any questions if anyone's got one. Yes? Or we need a microphone, I think, to get to you.
Oh, it's not on.
Can we get the microphone on?
Hey. Yeah, great. Good chat, in admiration of you all completely. I think you were all part of leading or participating in retreats last year for your community, all three of you, correct? And I'd love to hear about what that meant for you.
It's a great question. Oh gosh, the retreat spaces are just so phenomenal. Big gratitude again to McNabb Harris down here for bringing me along. The first time that we came together on retreat, which was actually November 2021. It was just like, I suddenly found myself in this space where I was with 25 Jewish people in rural Wales, and I just had never had that before. Just to be in a space where that was all, where my cultural identity was just reflected all around me. Like, I don't think I was really prepared for how emotional that was going to be at all. The kind of coming together of like two sides of my life, really, that had felt like they didn't ever meet. It just feels like the beginning of a very powerful journey into kind of like creating that community and what that looks like, and figuring it all out together, and knowing how, like, just finding all of our kind of like different experiences and weaving them and talking about them and singing together and praying together and being in nature, and it's beautiful and magical. And we get to talk about all the kind of like radical politics that we want to, and figure out our piece in that puzzle as well, and that is great. You know, that's just really super exciting. I've actually got a poem that I might read at the end of the session that I wrote on that first retreat, so I'll hold out for that.
Yeah, the retreats, they were amazing. They were really intense. And they were a labour of love. Like, I was very overwhelmed to find that they sort of came to be. They were like a figment of my imagination a couple of years ago, and I really sensed that what we really needed was just some space and some time with almost no agenda, just to be with each other. I think Jo might have more to say about this, only because my experiences of being like trying to hold everything together, and then also be like, everything's fine, I can lead this session, and then also be like, where's the food? You know, and so I think my experience of it was definitely was at a little bit of a distance, but I definitely had. It was a real sense of like a dream come true. There was like such vulnerability and such connection that arose spontaneously with almost no effort required. There was just such an instinctive like urge to be in community and to hold each other's complexity, and that came with complications, and it was not without its difficulties, and it was incredibly hard work and very tiring, but it was I think what it really showed was what was possible when we are given space to hold all that we carry with each other without explaining ourselves to anyone else. And that was it was divine, really. Honestly, I felt like the nature of time changed. Like, people were talking about just how long the day felt, and how long they felt that we were only there for really just over 2 days, and how literally when people were cared for and resourced and given everything that they needed for a little while, what could happen in that space. And it just makes you think about, like, why people who are extraordinarily wealthy can achieve so much. It's like, oh, if all of your needs are met, then you can be fucking brilliant. And it's like, yeah, that's hard for people who don't have any of their needs met without an enormous amount of effort or a fight. And so, I don't know, it definitely felt like a kind of portal into what was possible. It also broke my heart to see what was, to think that we actually all exist in the opposite of that, honestly. Yeah.
Yeah. That those retreats were deeply emotional for me. I spent a lot of time crying in the first one. There was something about the radical nature of bringing Black people of colour together in a space to rest. And there was actually a moment on the first retreat on the Sunday where the sun started shining, it broke through the clouds, and all of us were outside, and a lot of us were just kind of lying down and just basking in the sunlight. And I couldn't help but cry because I was like, we live in an industry and a world that is constantly pushing us to strive and work and to burn ourselves out, and to be in a space that is like, no, this is a space where you can feel at home, and you can connect to land, and you can also rest. Was just like completely radical, and I can't thank Claire enough for bringing them together in such a beautiful way. Thank you. Do we have any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. Hi. I just want to say thank you for even having this discussion, especially in this space, which is kind of interesting. Probably, even as I look around, and I have been walking around for the last couple of days wondering what was happening in this building over the many sort of decades, and also wondering how much of it was paid for by the work of those enslaved people. These are the stories that aren't often told, but it's really lovely to have these discussions happen. It was really interesting, though, that you said that land work is an act of political... I think you said something that's right at the beginning that was quite interesting. It was something like land work is a political act, maybe, or deeply political act, which was interesting because the work that I know that I do, working with racialized communities, it's about creating those spaces of healing and showing that value and nurturing and creating the connectedness and identity. But we're always battling and fighting against those systems of control and oppression. And so I kind of wondered if you could just expand on that comment that you made right at the beginning.
Yeah, sure. So I guess we already, as we're all here, we know that like the food system is like being involved in the food system and trying to grow small scale is political, right? But then when we bring in complex relationships to land and belonging, related to race, gender, queerness, all of these things, then the politics kind of becomes even more embroiled. And I feel that we miss something really huge when we apoliticize food growing, because when we do that, what we do is we marginalize all of these experiences and all of these people that come into growing. There's something that happens. There's something that gets missed, basically, when we think of food growing as something that is apolitical, because it's in my opinion, it's not. And then I think just off the back of that, if we're coming to food growing with some semblance of wanting to heal, alongside wanting to do all this other stuff we want to do with food growing, in my opinion, healing is also deeply political. Like, to heal the knowledge, the truth that colonialism has imprinted in my brain is a deeply political thing. I think there's so much that comes to it. I don't know if you guys want to...
Well, just on a kind of very rudimentary level, land is power and wealth who controls the land is who has power over so many different systems. And so I think that it, as a kind of, so the idea of like land as, working the land as a political act is, it's just like an uncontroversial statement to me, because it's like, or like one of the things that I, because most of my food growing happened in a kind of in a city, and so when you're using a piece of land that is, you know, being eyed up by developers or wants to be co-opted into kind of a side of capitalism that is extractive or has other visions of the future, and you are growing food into that land, that is inherently radical and it is inherently political, and the choices that we make about that and who has the ability to govern those choices or make those decisions for us is in itself a political thing. Like, who owns the land upon which we live is like, yeah, it can't not be political, because it is tied up with wealth and power, and often political power also, and so it totally bleeds into every aspect of our being. So, yeah.
I mean, I don't know that I've got massively more to add to what you said, but I suppose, you know, like, it's so ingrained, particularly in like black radical thoughts that came out of the States, you know, the idea to be able to like self-determine through land work and being able to connect to land, to be able to grow your own food, you know, the kind of, you can't free yourself till you feed yourself narrative is, you know, it kind of really underlines why land work is a deeply political act.
Thank you for that question.
I think we'll take a couple of questions from online.
This is a question from Deborah. In a world where we live in increasingly urban environments with complicated cultural interrelations, what are your thoughts on how we promote rootedness, land connections, and the hybridity you refer to in terms of stories and belonging?
Oof.
Yeah, I mean, it is, yeah, we've spoken a lot about the rural, so it is really interesting to bring it back to the urban. Interestingly, I work with a lot of urban farmers that, and I guess increasingly there are these amazing spaces where, you know, that like urban gardens have kind of boomed in the last, I don't know, 20 years. Mm-hmm. Much more so, I guess, it feels more of a kind of like burgeoning movement here in the UK. And I think one of the things in the UK that can be complicated in urban farming is it can feel like it's still a quite like middle class and white kind of back to the land growing movement, but not entirely. But yeah, I'm going to speak of the context I know, which is actually much more the American context, which is really bizarre, I suppose. But I work with a lot of amazing farmers in Detroit, mostly, where the urban narrative is actually really integral to the kind of like hybridity and creation of like authentic relation to land, because that city was, you know, the site of incredible deprivation for decades, and the kind of connection to land that then that grew out of those spaces was absolutely a kind of like reclamation of connection to the city, of being able to self-determine in the city, of being able to access food at all in the city, where actually for a while there was kind of like no supermarkets in Detroit, which is mind-blowing. And so, yeah, I think actually, you know, the kind of cultivation of urban soil and the kind of potential for kind of like health and spirituality and community growing is amazing and massive. Yeah. I thought that was a bit of a rambly question.
No, it was good. I mean, most of my food growing has happened in the city, and so for me, those two things aren't incongruent at all. I mean, I'm not trying to diminish or dilute how incredibly challenging it is to create enough opportunity and, you know, address all the barriers to access that people have in being in those spaces meaningfully and sustainably. But yeah, I mean, I'm new to the rural and forging a path in that way. But what brought me to food growing was growing amongst, I mean, I literally the first place I ever grew was a rooftop farm in New York City, and it was, you could see the Manhattan skyline, like that. Although it did take me some time to recognize how radical that was, that has always been the context in which I've grown. And so I think it's really possible, and I think that the speed with which you understand how powerful that act is accelerated when it happens in a city, because it's so incredible and so remarkable and so powerful and so political and radical that yeah, I think we just need to see more of that, and that's a question for another panel. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Cool. I think maybe we'll stop there, because we're...
maybe one more question from my friend Poppy at the back, maybe. And then we can put some...
Thank you. Bear with me as I kind of try and construct the question, but it's around language. You were speaking about your great-grandmother, sort of the language dying with her. My heritage, I'm half Nigerian, and I only speak English. My dad speaks Igbo, which is the kind of language of our tribe. And I often think about tying into the sense of belonging, the kind of disconnect that we experience when we don't have the language as a kind of glasses to view the world, if that makes sense. Because when we learn new language, it's a different way of seeing the world. So I suppose from the perspective of diaspora and language and belonging, I'd love to hear some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely feel like I've just got a lot of grief there. It just feels like there's so much that is that I probably can't access now because of that disconnect in the language. And I think I could go and learn the Dino, but it's like, it's not alive anywhere. It's not like a spoken language anymore in any country. And that just makes me feel like not just my own capacity, but anyone's capacity to like access all of the richness that was in there, in that language. And in those songs, I think particularly when I like listen to like songs sung, it's just like, we don't know what they're saying, and that's tragic. And that, you know, when you like, you know, there's like, I guess there's probably, it's kind of like an oral tradition and a folk tradition, and it's prior to really a lot of the written tradition, and particularly because it would have been a real language of the home, it would have been the language of like storytelling, and I guess. Yeah, I mean, I just really echo what you're saying, that you feel like you lose a lens by which you could view the world in order with that kind of dying. And also, I'm just so frustrated that it didn't get handed down. That, like, I suppose that I understand why. Like, I understand that, you know, like for my grandparents' generation, the kind of like extreme desire to assimilate, to like become British, was just so important. The kind of, you know, my grandmother, who was not born in this country, spoke with like, you know, BBC broadcast like English. She just sounded like so English. It was ridiculous. It's just like the fact that she didn't feel like she could learn, or that she wasn't taught, and that it wasn't even taught like discreetly or anything, that it didn't feel like it could be handed down is just such a big loss.
Yeah, I mean, I feel really similarly. While I can poorly speak Mauritian Kreyol, I, in my desperate desire to assimilate, resisted learning it, you know, and resisted my parents when they spoke to me in any other language other than English, and cursed that child, honestly, because I really wish that I had. I wish I could speak fluently. Like, I'll never know all the stories of all my grandparents have passed away now, but I just don't know who they are. I don't know who they were, and that will be a grief I'll carry forever. And while I can certainly work on learning and speaking better, and, you know, and practicing more, you know, I think there will always be something that I have to accept, that there is a loss there. But then I suppose it sort of harks back to the conversation we had before about hybridization and creolization and fugitivity. Like, trying to use that which I have, including my 2 fluent parents, to maybe access some element of something that I can bring into my world and make new and make mine and make tradition and ritual. But yeah, there is something really powerful there when you can't speak the language of your heritage, of your family, and a grief that needs, that I don't know if it'll ever be healed, but it's something I know I'll carry and want to find ways to carry with more ease, maybe. Thank you. It's a beautiful question.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you both for your amazing discussion, and thank you all for being so present and listening so beautifully. Rachel, would you like to give your poem?
Would like to hear a poem?
Yeah. Yes.
Poem to end, okay. And try not to make all my panelists cry. Okay. So yeah, I wrote this on the Jewish Land Justice Retreat in 2021. I've lived here for years, in this place, with the twisted oaks, with the green sage lichen blooming. I have plunged my hands into these ice-cold, clear Welsh mountain waters, brushed fingertips across the curved cob buildings, greeted the distant hills and the mossy stones. I wasn't alone here. I was among human kin who held me, and we laughed and sang, and we built and we raged and we visioned together. And I thought that they knew me. I think that they know me. And here again, I submerged my body ceremonially into water, and you called it mikveh. And that made the ceremony mine. You who have never met me, and I thought you didn't know me. And we sing together in the wild, like I've done 1,000 times, like we do every day. And we harmonized, but you called it prayer. What makes it prayer here with you? It feels like prayer. And you showed me the script, the letters I was taught to read as a child that I can still follow, proud that this foreign text is my text. And you brought it here, to the moss and the rain, and you let me touch it. And I thought you didn't know me, and I thought I knew this land. But now I see that you do know me, and we are this land.
Thank you so much, that was beautiful. I also feel like I should plug that Claire's book is actually in this building downstairs. You can buy it. It's called Unearthed, and it's on the Blackwell stall, so definitely go down and get yourself a copy. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you both.